The following is a production of Professor Robert Barnwell. Each episode includes insights provided by the chairman, CEOs, and CFOs of the world's most successful corporations, as well as thought leaders from premier business schools and international consultancies. If you and your team would like more information on corporate leadership and strategic management, or would like to learn more about Professor Barnwell, his research, and how he may be able to assist your company, please visit Professor Barnwell's website at robertgbarnwell.com.
Hello and welcome to CFO Talk Radio. I'm your host, Robert Barnwell. During the last episode, we brought you the concluding episode of a special 4-part series featuring several senior professionals from KPMG. During episode 15, we spoke with 2 KPMG professionals in a unique roundtable discussion. The discussion featured previous guest Steve Miller, the national leader of KPMG's Integration and Separation Services practice, and John McPhee, a partner in KPMG's Advisory Transactions Services and the leader of KPMG's Sell-Side Services. Steve and John joined us to discuss a particularly important and potentially powerful topic, divestitures. This is episode 16, and we'll be joined by William Sihler, the Ronald Edward Cieszynski Professor in Business Administration at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business, to talk about the thoughts and suggestions contained within his book, Financial Turnarounds, Preserving Enterprise Value, which he co-authored along with Henry Davis. Bill, welcome to CFO Talk Radio.
Thank you very much.
I'm really pleased that you were able to join us. I think the listeners are aware that my own professional and academic background has long been focused on financial restructuring and turnaround management, as well as competitive strategy and high-performance leadership. And in my experience working with clients and research, I found that the principles that we'll talk about today are really the same principles that can not only save an underperforming company, but can also really significantly improve the performance of an otherwise well-performing company. But before we talk more about some of these principles, maybe it's worth a few minutes of our time really talking about some of the traditional causes of corporate underperformance.
Well, it seems to me that probably the most important one that I see is rapid growth, and it affects small and large companies different ways. The small entrepreneurial company is usually headed by a guy or a gal who is sales-oriented, very dynamic, believes in the company, but somehow thinks that sales drop to the bottom line at some point. They tend to be control folks. They don't like to delegate. They like to make all the decisions. And when the company begins to get large enough to be more than a one-man show, then they don't put on the necessary staff. And so they lose control of the business. If they're making a product, they have problems with their inventory. And the good things just never quite happen. In a larger company, my observation is that the problems tend to arise when the company's traditional business begins to peak out. And particularly these days, when companies are under pressure from analysts to generate high rates of return, even if the existing business doesn't really return that, the managements then start to look around to see what they can do to enhance their return by buying businesses that might have a more rapid growth. The problem there is that those businesses are all too often in a different field. The management didn't know enough about them to appraise them properly in the first place, and they get into trouble fairly quickly. That tends to draw management attention away from the core business, which also gets into problems as a result. So it's growth in both cases, but in one case it's growth, organic growth in essence, in a small business that gets beyond the capacity of the entrepreneur. In the other case, it's an effort to try to revive growth that tends to create problems. If you look at the number of companies that tried to get into the financial services industry and the financial supermarket era, that were getting into it because their basic business was somewhat more stagnant. Sears Roebuck, Xerox for just two, and then they found themselves with investments that they weren't able to handle, and they also had lost their focus on their core. So that I guess you might call a sort of weak management and badly planned or executed expansion. The management themselves may not necessarily be weak, but they were weak in their inability, for example, in the smaller business, to put in the control systems, to pay attention to controls, to delegate properly. And in the larger businesses, they overestimated their ability to manage businesses with which they were not really very familiar.
Interesting.
I think that gets back into the question, the issue of timing and information, particularly in a small business. Without the control systems, it's hard for management to know what's going on. And if you have a manager who was sort of used to running things based on what they could see by walking around the plant and so on, well, when you got multiple plants, that no longer works. And likewise in the larger businesses that try to get into areas they don't know much about, there again, the management doesn't know how to interpret the data that they receive.
All right. Well, I've noticed an almost universal tendency among senior management to really ignore or excuse underperformance in the first several quarters. And what I mean by this is usually there's an excuse, and it amounts to something more or less like this. Something's going on in the external market, and it's eventually going to go away on its own relatively soon, and our growth and profitability will return relatively quickly. And it's not until the company experiences problems in cash flow or restrictions in its access to the capital markets, or it's depleted its cash reserves, that management really recognizes that there's an actual problem that needs to be addressed. But as I tell my clients and my students, corporate underperformance is not unlike human health. If you catch and treat something early in the process, you'll almost always find that you've got more alternatives and then eventually a better outcome. What are some of the early warning signs that you think we should be aware of so that we're more likely to address these challenges before they become a real crisis?
Well, your observation strikes me as being absolutely in accord with what I've seen. And if I can just add a minor point to it, and that is that boards of directors are even more disadvantageous because they're farther away from the nature of the problem. And so it may be 6 to 9 months before they even become concerned enough to start maybe having some meetings on the side to discuss what the CEO is doing and where the problems might be, and maybe some help is needed. It seems to me that because the blame is placed on the outside and externalities, the proper response is for the senior management to familiarize themselves with those externalities, to make sure they understand them properly, and that are they really there. Senior management can't get in and manage the divisions of the business that well, but they need to do things like checking with customers, checking with suppliers, trying to see what really is going on. If they have an engineering problem, as I've known some companies to have, that's blamed upon, well, the suppliers aren't supplying right, then the CEO or the CEO's deputy really should go contact those folks and see if they're getting the same story from the suppliers that their internal management is giving them. So there are some ways to try to check, but they do mean that somebody from the top floor has got to get more involved in some of those details to try to verify the problem. The old Rath Packing Company out in Waterloo, Iowa, that claimed that they had the largest packing plant under one roof. The problem there was that wasn't what you needed, because the packing plants like Iowa Beef were diversifying out into the field, putting up small plants and being able to be closer to the animals and for a whole variety of reasons keep their costs down. My recollection is that the management began to explain their problem by saying, well, there was a little strike, a little difficulty there, and it would all be cured in due course. And of course it wasn't. It was a much more basic strategic issue that had somehow escaped the board and the management. And the company, unfortunately, never recovered, and their very good Black Hawk bacon disappeared from the market.
All right. Well, your book does, I think, really a terrific job of outlining the key objectives throughout each stage of the turnaround process. And here I'm specifically talking about the suggestions that you provide in Chapter 5 of the book. Can you take us through each of these 3 turnaround stages and perhaps what objectives we should target for completion during each stage?
Okay, well, as my co-author and I see it from our research and elsewhere, there are 3 stages, the first of which is like emergency room at a hospital. You've got serious cash outflow. The company has got to in some way get enough cash to keep operating. And that becomes if that can't be solved, then the company is clearly gone. The second stage is that when you have the cash flow under control, and at least it's no longer bleeding, then the issue is, have you got a viable business there? And what do you have to do to make it viable? And then the third stage says, all right, you now have a viable business, but the chances are very high that the capital structure was designed for quite a different business than you now have. And therefore, in the third stage, you have to go about renegotiating or negotiating the restructuring of the finances so that the operating opportunities of the company are consistent with the financial demands on it. In the first stage, and by the way, my observation is that frequently it takes different people to effect each stage. For example, the guy that comes in to deal with the cash flow problems frequently has to make some very, very difficult and harsh decisions in terms of laying people off, canceling projects, doing a lot of things which save the company but can make the individual very unpopular. And therefore, when it comes time to trying to work stuff out, the individual may have frightened the remaining employees. He may have had poor relations with the various banks and financial sources that he's had to say, look, if you don't cooperate here, you aren't going to get anything. And in addition, my sort of observation, not confirmed by any scientific data, says that the individuals of that sort may not really want to stay on and do something that's a little quieter. They get a nice adrenaline rush from coming in and being there during the 6 to 9 months when the business has to be stabilized. Now, the second phase, the viable business plan, is a somewhat more leisurely one. There, the individual has to be able to identify a long-run strategy for the company's survival. What products, what business can it be in, and where can it compete effectively? And that may mean selling off pieces of the business that haven't already been sold off to generate cash, focusing the firm, making sure that there are adequate people staffed to deliver the longer term opportunities that they've identified, and it's quite a different set of activities than are in that first very chaotic stage when suddenly there isn't enough money to meet the payroll. The third stage usually requires more of a financial expertise than it does an operating expertise. And in that sense, the CEO may find that the CEO is working with outside assistants, investment bankers and the like, to try to persuade the constituents that are either in bankruptcy or are creditors that are holding their breath to see what happens, that they probably have to take a haircut in order to get anything going. And this requires specialized talents, which, as I say, the CEO may not have, and they have to be hired from the outside. But in some senses, most CEOs won't have ever had much experience with that, whereas the authorities in the area have done that more than once, because that's why they actually become an authority. And hopefully, when all 3 phases have been successfully completed, the company will be back sustainable position. It can support its financing, and everybody lives happily ever after. And perhaps the company at that point is in a good position to be sold for a nice price for the creditors who are still there. Well, and again, my observation is that frequently the third phase, the people that are excited by the first phase don't find the second phase very exciting. The people that really enjoy getting the business sorted out and on its feet again are usually not the people who want to stay on and run it after the situation is all clarified. They may stay on during the period while the financing is resorted, because they're running the business at that point, and it's still maybe shaky. But when the structure is all set up and the company is going again, those individuals will maybe take their options and go off and do the same thing again for somebody else that they just don't want to stay in and run a business. Although I did run into one former student who turned around 3 companies, and he said, I've done enough of that. I'm going to stay with the third one and enjoy a somewhat less hectic life.
Well, it is funny that you should mention that, because one of the participants in my research is a New York Stock Exchange listed company, and the CEO had come from GE. And he had hired a COO who was a turnaround expert and did really well in the first 18 months. But the CEO was almost apologetic that he had to eventually let this person go. And I think that what happens is not only do you have the adrenaline and the excitement that comes from a turnaround, but you also have a singular focus on cash management and cost cutting, which is not your focus when you're trying to once you've gotten to the point where you've stabilized the business and you're trying to prepare for strategic growth. There you need a little bit more, leniency in terms of your capital expenditures and your outlays. And a lot of turnaround guys they hate to part with a buck.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. There's a different focus, a different approach, and it doesn't translate well into the second, third requirements.
Right. Well, as you point out, there's almost a universal law in turnaround management that you first have to stop the bleeding. And this typically focuses on an underperforming company's propensity to really unnecessarily burn through its cash reserves, if any, and free cash flows. And one of the first things that I think that the company should perhaps look at is maybe looking at its current debt facilities and amortization. Maybe looking at ways of extending maturities on debt, relax restrictive covenants, maybe restructure the payments into a balloon, bullet, or payment in kind, and then maybe raise equity, if any. And then by restructuring the debt and equity, you can stem this bleeding and buy a little bit more time for more invasive strategic and operational initiatives. But beyond, the capital structure and restructuring specific debt obligations, as I've mentioned, there are really a host of financial management activities that can and do have significant and an almost immediate impact on the success of the turnaround, and which you and your co-author have really done a good job in terms of detailing within your own book. So I'm wondering if you'd perhaps share some of these activities and objectives.
Well, if they start early enough that they can affect the kinds of changes you propose, that's all to the good, because that again suggests that they've spotted the problem much earlier than many companies do. Because by the time many companies spot the problem, they are in a position whereby the financial institutions have cut off credit and they've run out of cash. But if they can find it early enough, not only can they restructure their institutional relationships, but they may want to start thinking about what they can do with their customers and their suppliers. For example, and assuming the business is sound and is running in a temporary problem, then if you have suppliers or customers that are for whom you're critical, then they are sources of finance. In the sense you can get the customers to pay a little faster. You can ask them for down payments or partial payments on completion. You can ask the suppliers to extend you additional credit or take notes along the way, because the suppliers and the customers are making a lot more out of you than the banks are. And so, therefore, they are in a position to take greater risks. If you think of the banks, bank is making maybe a spread after cost of 0.5%, maybe if they're lucky on a loan. The trade is probably making something like 20% on the funds that they have extended to you in the form of payables, and so they're in a much better position to extend your credit. Likewise, your customers, if they depend upon your product, are going to be willing to help you out if it's a temporary problem. If it's a more serious problem, then going to your customers to see if they would be willing to invest in the business. This can be very touchy if you have multiple large customers, and one of them is what might be viewed as getting a preference. However, if that happens, if you get in that position, you simply have to go to the other customers and say, look, here's the chance for you to do as well. We're going to treat everybody alike. So-and-so has got a preferred stock, and they're not really interested in long-term investment, but they're helping us out. If you want to join in, fine. If not, we're going to treat everybody the same. That does not give this one customer a particular advantage. And suppliers can sometimes work the same way. They can convert their trade credit to some form of equity, which again slows things down. The basic issue, though, is if you're in that kind of a bind, the basic cash flow situation has to be resolved, and it certainly can give you time to resolve it if you can lengthen out the terms. But getting back to your earlier point about the tendency to postpone stuff, unless those problems are identified and dealt with, merely tinkering with the financing is not going to do more than gain a little time.
Very good point. Well, I'm sure there are really a host of lessons that senior executives could and should take from the Great Recession. From your perspective, what lessons do you think are particularly important that executives should take with them, hopefully into a new phase of growth?
Well, it seems to me one of the most important lessons is don't go too near the edge of the cliff. If you think about the capital structure theory that says you have to do your debt and equity structure so that you have the greatest value for the entity, it looks sort of as though that greatest value is on a bit of more of a plateau than it is a Matterhorn. And so if you push yourself all close to the edge of that plateau, try to squeak every little bit of extra value out of the financial structure, you're vulnerable to a change in the financial markets, which, as we've seen, can happen very, very fast, and which what looked like a nice plateau suddenly sinks into the ocean and shrinks in size. And if you're out on the edge, you're going to be like Wile E. Coyote, suddenly out in the middle of the air, waving your arms and legs and getting ready to fall to a serious blow. The amount of extra benefit you get from pushing out to that degree, time and again, has been suggested in good times, makes it very, very vulnerable. Now, again, the problem you have on that score is that if you're too conservative, then you're apt to be subject to a takeover candidate, and therefore it's a trade-off. But going too near the edge of that cliff it can be very serious. The second one is to make sure that in good times you cultivate your sources of emergency funding, whether it's funding as such or whether it's suppliers providing you with something. It might not work, but you certainly won't have those sources available if you've treated people in an ugly manner. They will remember, and when you're in trouble, they will remember that you weren't very helpful to them when they needed you. A third point is to beware of letting overhead get out of control. This has always been a problem with the financial industry, because like universities, because most of their costs are people. But fixed costs come in on two legs, and you've got to start getting rid of it as soon as the economy begins to soften. I ran into a fellow some years ago who had brought his company, or I guess he acquired it during the Depression, and it made material handling equipment. And he was so nervous about Depression-like things that if he detected a downturn, he would lock the plant gate with a chain until the operations management had worked out a reduced production schedule, because he knew the danger of building up inventory in a shrinking economy. So being very careful to keeping overhead under control, and also again, watching the inventory. And finally, it seems to me another thing that I've watched companies doing here is that if the leadership can challenge the entire organization to respond, it's amazing what can be done. If it becomes a simple top-down pushing, firing people and so on, doesn't seem to be nearly as productive as a management which has the ability, the leadership ability, and I guess the behavior in the past, so that they're viewed as being fair to everybody and not ripping the company off. That the organization will respond and recognize that they're going to have to cut stuff back. People are going to have to be released. Work hours are going to have to go down. Projects are going to have to be canceled. But that it's not being done simply to enhance the senior management. It's being done to save the company.
Well, terrific parting thoughts. Today we've been talking to Bill Sihler, the Ronald Edward Trzynski Professor of Business Administration at the University of Virginia's Darden School of Business, about the thoughts and suggestions contained within his book, Financial Turnarounds, Preserving Enterprise Value, which he co-authored along with Henry Davis and is available at Amazon.com, Barnes & Nobles, and any number of independent bookstores near you. Bill, really, many thanks for joining us today, and I sincerely hope that you'll join us again sometime in the not-too-distant future.
It would be my pleasure and privilege, Robert. Thank you for having me.
That was William Sihler, the Ronald Edward Trzynski Professor in Business Administration at the University of Virginia's well-regarded Darden School of Business, talking with us about the thoughts and suggestions contained within his book, Financial Turnarounds, Preserving Enterprise Value, which he co-authored along with Henry Davis. Please join us for our next episode when we speak with consultant Paul Niven, the author of the powerful Balanced Scorecard Step-by-Step, Maximizing Performance and Maintaining Results. Until then, this is Robert Barnwell and CFO Talk Radio wishing you all the best.
We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and found the material of value. To download a transcript of this episode, receive a free subscription to the show, or to learn more about this subject, we encourage you to visit Professor Barnwell's website at robertgbarnwell.com to explore the many executive briefings, presentations, case studies, and other resources available for immediate download. This has been a production of Robert G. Barnwell. All rights reserved.